Okay, let's get into this. I want you to just, for a moment, imagine a scene. It's a Thursday morning in Tehran, sometime after the revolution. Outside, you have the mandated rules of the Islamic Republic. They're suffocatingly strict. Women are required by law to wear the manto, the headscarf, everything cloaked in black. It's designed to suppress every contour, every single splash of color that suggests you're an individual. But walk past those guarded university gates, turn down a specific cul-de-sac, and climb the stairs to a sun-drenched second-story dining room.
And inside that room, everything just shifts. You have 7 women who've quietly shed their mandatory coverings. They are not meeting for prayer or for political strategy. They're gathered almost in this conspiratorial silence around a table and their lesson plans. Well, they're a shocking juxtaposition to the world right outside that window. They're studying Vladimir Nabokov's deeply controversial novel, Lolita.
Lolita.
And right alongside it, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Henry James's Washington Square.
The sheer risk involved here, it just transforms classic fiction from, a literary exercise into an active political statement. So our mission today is a deep dive into this extraordinary environment. We're drawing from sources that chronicle how this secret literature class, how it functioned as this shared clandestine language, and really as an act of profound personal resistance against a hostile totalitarian regime.
And this is a memoir. It's centered around the experiences of the host of that seminar. She started the classes after she resigned from the University of Alama Tabatabai. That was a university that was supposedly one of the most liberal, yet it was under constant ideological surveillance.
Right, so this class wasn't a distraction.
Not at all. It was a planned, active withdrawal from a reality that had turned hostile.
We're going to dissect the architecture of that prized sanctuary, explore how figures like Nabokov became these unexpected guides to understanding the architecture of dread they were living in. And we'll discover the core lessons these students took from Western fiction about surviving with integrity and, empathy intact when the entire public world is structured on a lie. So let's start with the physical space, because the setting of the class, it immediately defined this tension between the closed world outside and the urgent necessity of the open world they were trying to create inside.
Absolutely. The apartment itself on the second story, it became this kind of psychological buffer. It overlooked a cul-de-sac and the former American hospital, which had been renamed and was, constantly overflowing with wounded war veterans. So the street below was this perpetual scene of noise, of chaos, of suffering, the raw, messy reality of the revolution and the war with Iraq.
But the architecture itself provided a peculiar kind of natural censorship. From where the host sat at the table, she couldn't actually see the street directly. Instead, opposite her chair was this antique oval mirror. And in that reflection, all the chaos below was just obscured. It left only the distant, beautiful Elburz Mountains visible, capped with snow.
That is such a fascinating psychological detail, isn't it? It illustrates the class's core theme, this difficult, often painful relationship between fiction and reality. The everyday intrusions of the regime, all the noise, the anxiety, they were filtered out. And it leaves only this beautiful, distant, almost fictionalized view in the reflection. So they were reading everything from ancient Persian classics like the tales of Scheherazade from 1001 Nights, all the way to Henry James and Jane Austen. And they were explicitly seeking a link between the open spaces these novels provided and the closed spaces they were confined to.
And the composition of the students themselves, it really reflects this struggle for synthesis. They were a carefully curated group. They weren't chosen based on, ideological or religious alignment, but because they shared what the source calls this peculiar mixture of fragility and courage. They were mostly loners, but together they formed this unique collective intimacy.
It was a very conscious effort to establish a sacred space, a communal version of Virginia Woolf's A Room of Her Own. And the achievement was how they managed to maintain this space despite the profound ideological gulfs separating them.
You could see that gulf so clearly in contrasting figures like Mashid and Azin. Mashid came from a devout Muslim background. She was soft-spoken, proper, and she always observed the veil even before it was mandatory. Yet, despite her piety, she'd been jailed for 5 years for affiliation with a dissident religious organization. The jailing left her with a permanently impaired kidney. Her quiet dignity was born out of enduring just, true horror.
And then you had Azin, who was, she was utterly different. She was outspoken, she wore bright makeup, which was a minor act of defiance in itself, and she was mainly concerned with discussing sexual experiences and desires. These are matters that were just utterly repressed by the regime. And these differences, they weren't just academic, they caused real friction. Ezin's frankness made Mashid and another student, Mana, intensely uncomfortable. But despite that potential for conflict, their loyalty to the space and its intellectual ideals of finding a language to talk about their internal lives, that was paramount.
The ultimate expression of this tension, this enforced public identity versus the authentic private self, is captured by the striking metaphor of the two photographs. They were taken on the very last night the group met.
Oh, the visual impact of these images it's just astonishing. Photo 1 shows the 7 women rigidly posed, cloaked entirely in the required black chador and headscarves. They are uniform. Their identities are suppressed, covered, interchangeable, exactly how the regime wanted to define them.
Exactly. But then, the second photograph. Same women, same room, same wall, only now they've taken off their coverings, and the source details this. Splashes of color separate one from the next. They become distinct individuals defined by the personal choices they made about clothing style, jewelry, their hair.
It perfectly isolates the central conflict of their existence. The public, enforced fiction of the regime, demanded uniformity and invisibility. It transformed them into hooded creatures, while their private, colorful reality asserted their complexity, their individuality, their inner lives. In that room, they reclaimed their physical and visual selves.
And that reclamation was buttressed by these shared rituals and a newly invented language. I mean, even the simple act of brewing and serving tea became an aesthetic ritual. Tea served in those delicate, slim-waisted, transparent glasses.
It was a small, repeated act of beauty, something performed several times a day in Iran, an essential part of hospitality. But inside the class, it became a sacred ritual. It was a deliberate attempt to assert aesthetic control and grace in a world that was defined by ugliness and moral clumsiness.
But the truly secret defense mechanism was linguistic, and it was born out of their shared love for Nabokov, the word upsilamba. It was shouted by Yassi, who loved playing with language, and it became their insider code.
It wasn't a real word, but it symbolized something profoundly important, which Yassi had connected to their reading of Nabokov. That vague sense of joy, the tingle in the spine Nabokov expected his readers to feel. It was that sudden, electric recognition of truth or beauty within the text.
And that single made-up word, it became the starting point for their repository of coded words and expressions. It functionally separated the good readers, those who truly understood the subtle, subversive joy of fiction, from the ordinary ones. For Nasrin, one of the students, it was the magic code that opened the door to a secret cave filled with treasures.
And that is the ultimate act of resistance, isn't it? Defining a new reality through a vocabulary that the regime could neither understand nor penetrate. They were building a shared, invisible reality defined by the aesthetic and emotional recognition of beauty, joy, and truth, entirely outside the ideological constraints of the state.
So moving from language creation to political critique, Nabokov might seem like an odd choice, given his focus on aesthetics and wordplay. But the source material makes this powerful case that his novels were essential texts for understanding life under a totalitarian regime.
Their deep appreciation for Nabokov, particularly Invitation to a Beheading, it stemmed from its ability to perfectly articulate the unique psychological texture of dread they experienced daily in the Islamic Republic. The hero, Cincinnati C., he's sentenced to death not for a violent crime, but for Gnostic turpitude.
Gnostic turpitude. That phrase is just so incredibly loaded. The charge is essentially being opaque, being an individual whose inner self doesn't conform to the state's demand for complete ideological and behavioral transparency.
Precisely. Totalitarianism demands that citizens be predictable and easily legible. Cincinnati C's crime is his insistence on an inner, unique self that cannot be fully known or controlled by the state. He possesses a private world, and that is a capital offense. And this mirrored the feeling of living under a regime that demanded constant ideological conformity in every public and private gesture.
And the constant torment Cincinnatus faces in the novel, it mirrors the arbitrary nature of the regime itself. The rules of his execution are constantly manipulated. The executioners change the time of death daily, turning every single day into a living execution day.
And that instability is reinforced by the blurring of roles. The jailer, the defense lawyer, the director, they're all the same man, constantly shifting their uniforms. Even the environment is staged. A fake moon, a fake spider on the wall. It's this illusory, terrifying world where you cannot differentiate between your savior and your executioner.
And here's where the analysis becomes so relevant for you, for the listener. The students didn't just see this as some literary metaphor. They connected this fictional absurdity directly to their lived reality. So what were the real-life, fake moons and arbitrary rules they were dealing with.
Well, the rules imposed by the Islamic Republic were just as capricious as Cincinnatus's execution date. Students were penalized for the most mundane, non-ideological things. Sanaz was almost sent home for wearing a simple blush. Students were scolded for laughing too loudly in the hallways or for running up the stairs when late for class. And these trivial infractions, when they're enforced with state authority, they generate that constant, low-level atmosphere of perpetual dread.
We see this arbitrariness even in the host's own resignation. When she announced she was quitting the university, her friends told her the authorities might not accept it. Not because she was invaluable, but because she didn't have the right to quit. They were the ones who decided when she should be dismissed or dispensed with.
This constant intrusion, this feeling that even small decisions were subject to official whim, that was the essence of the nightmarish quality Nabokov captured. And Nabokov provided them with a specific term for the official ugliness that defined their social environment. Posh list.
Posh list. It sounds like simply kitsch or, bad taste, but Nabokov's definition is far more sinister. It's more spiritual.
Oh, it is much deeper than vulgarity. Nabokov defined posh list as the falsely important, the falsely beautiful, the falsely clever, the falsely attractive. It is a specific kind of spiritual and aesthetic vulgarity inherent in manufactured sincerity, the cheap artifice of a regime trying to impose its own version of morality and beauty.
And the students recognize posh lust everywhere. The source material provides these unforgettable, concrete Iranian examples. They detail street vendors who were selling live chickens that had been dipped in shocking pink, brilliant red, or turquoise blue paint.
In order to make them more attractive.
Exactly.
It's a fascinating sensory offense. A cheap, violent attempt to manufacture aesthetic appeal where the natural form would be just fine. And similarly, they cite the plastic flowers, bright pink and blue artificial gladiolas that were carted out at the university for both morning ceremonies and celebrations.
The insight here is that these artificial, brightly colored items represented the regime's superficial, cheap attempts to manufacture importance or genuine feeling. So the students sought authentic, lasting beauty in literature, while the outside world was just choked by this impressive aesthetic lie.
And perhaps the most perfect illustration of the absurd fictionality ruling their lives was the story of the blind censor, which connects directly back to the staging and invitation to a beheading.
Okay, so until 1994, the chief film censor in Iran was remarkably nearly blind. He would listen to audio tapes of scripts or sit in a theater and dictate cuts based on an assistant's explanations. He was judging visual art without being able to see it.
But the absurdity doesn't even end there. When he was replaced by a non-blind successor, the new censor, he continued the exact same established nonsensical system. It wasn't about the content, it was about the arbitrary process of control.
That detail is chilling. The women realized their world was being shaped by the colorless lenses of the blind censor, where reality itself was constantly being rearranged. And they were, at the same time, trying to invent themselves, while knowing they were also figments of someone else's imagination.
And that brings us to their central controversial text, Lolita. For the class, this wasn't a story of aesthetic high-wire acts. It was a profound personal exploration of victimhood and the essential importance of narrative control.
I have to pause here, Lolita. In that environment, wasn't that an incredibly risky text, not just politically, but morally, given the subject matter? How did they manage the inherent controversy?
It was risky, absolutely, but they engaged with it head-on. They focused fiercely on the moral dimension. They unanimously sided with Lolita, aligning themselves with Vera Nabokov's famous critique of Western critics who dismiss Lolita as a moppet or a brat. Vera had pointed out that these critics missed the tender description of the child's helplessness, her pathetic dependence on monstrous HH.
And their core insight, the source of its relevance for them, was that Lolita is a double victim.
Exactly. Humbert, the unreliable narrator, the seducer, the captor, he not only took her life through abuse and entrapment, but he committed the second and perhaps greater crime. He took her life story. He controlled the narrative, seducing the reader just as he attempted to seduce Lolita herself.
Right. Humbert's prose, which, as the host noted, often views toward the shamelessly overwrought, is an attempt to manipulate the reader whom he addresses as the ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He tries to paint himself as this tortured artist.
But the class, they train their focus on the moments where the narrative cracks, where it hints at Lolita's utter vulnerability. They highlighted the scene after her mother's death when the deeply traumatized Lolita came sobbing into his room simply because she had absolutely nowhere else to go.
Hmm.
That single line just cuts through all of Humbert's literary defenses.
And this became the driving political motivation for the women in the secret class. They determined that their primary mission was to prevent themselves from falling victim to this second crime, the loss of their own narrative.
Because the regime was constantly attempting to define them. They were never free of the regime's definition of them as Muslim women. We had become the figment of someone else's dreams. And they recognized that if they lost control of their own stories, they would become as tragically silent as Lolita was in the hands of her sophisticated tormentor. Fiction, for them, was a way to write themselves back into existence in their own words.
These profound insights that were generated in the dining room sanctuary, they stand in such stark contrast to the intellectual chaos and ideological rigidness of the university system which the host had recently fled.
The University of Tehran was a microcosm of the revolutionary struggle. It was known as the Navel, the immovable center of political and social activities. Its symbolic importance was so great that the new Islamic government claimed it as the site of weekly Friday prayers, physically asserting the Islamic faction's victory over leftist and secular groups.
So when the host first began teaching there, she immediately emphasized the subversive potential of great fiction. She cited the German philosopher Theodor Adorno, telling her students, "The highest form of morality is not to feel at home in one's own home."
She was challenging them. She was stating that the best fiction forces you to be a stranger in your own house, making you question everything you take for granted. But the students were already bitterly and visibly divided. You had the leftists, easily identified by their full mustaches and standardized khaki clothing, the staunch Muslims wearing chadors and beards, and then those who looked entirely out of place, like Zarin and Vida, who were described as pastel and serene.
The environment was just hostile, and the faculty purges were ongoing. Professors were accused of everything from using obscene language to being CIA agents. So to confront this intense ideological pressure, the host staged a symbolic event, the trial of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby.
Which is a brilliant strategy,
Right.
using the protected space of literature to discuss dangerous political concepts. The prosecution was led by Mr. Nyasi, a stern student who represented the Orthodox Islamic worldview. His argument was that Gatsby was decadent, materialistic, and fundamentally immoral.
Let's break down his specific points, because they really reveal the ideological lens through which the regime viewed West culture. He argued that the book preached illicit relations, citing Tom and his mistress. He claimed Gatsby was a charlatan, an adulterer, and a liar, a destroyer of homes.
And here is the truly fascinating conclusion of the prosecution. Mr. Nazi asserted that the only sympathetic character in the entire novel was the cuckolded husband, Mr. Wilson, whose act of killing Gatsby was, in his words, the hand of God. For him, moral order demanded the violent punishment of decadence.
Wow. So standing against this severe moral framework was Zarin, who led the defense. And she argued that the novel was not a celebration of materialism, but a devastating critique of the carelessness and fundamental dishonesty of the wealthy elite, like the Buchanans, who operate without consequence.
The host then provided the defense's final synthesis, defining the criteria of great literature. A novel's quality lies in its democratic nature, its capacity to show the complexity of individuals and create space for all characters to have a voice. And she concluded that empathy is at the heart of Gatsby. The biggest sin is to be blind to others' problems and pains.
And Zarin seized on that point, turning the literary critique into a clear, albeit veiled, political attack on the regime itself. She suggested that the blindness and carelessness in the novel were a powerful reminder of those who see the world in black and white, drunk on the righteousness of their own fictions.
It was a direct jab at the prosecutor and the ideological rigidity of the governing mindset. The silence that followed that statement was telling. Students silently gathered around Zarin in support after the trial, confirming intellectual assent, but very few dared to voice their agreement publicly. That just reveals the potent power of fear in silencing even private intellectual consensus.
And that silent support was well earned, because the threat of personal risk and real violence was omnipresent, even at the university.
Oh, the environment was utterly hostile. We read the horrific account of the morality teacher who, in enforcing dress code, cut one girl's nails so short that she drew blood. Simply because they were deemed too long or decorative, it's a calculated act of small, humiliating violence designed to assert total physical control.
And then there's the truly shocking story of Sanaz. She was jailed and beaten, along with 5 friends, merely for the perceived impropriety of visiting a friend's fiancé by the Caspian Sea. They were subjected to invasive virginity tests and physical abuse.
The casual cruelty of the jailers is what sticks with you. Her captors joked that because Sanaz was thin and wore an extra t-shirt under her required robe, she wouldn't feel the pain of the beating as much, so they deliberately gave her more. That level of dehumanization, where even a protective layer of clothing is used as a justification for increased violence, is what the students were confronting every day.
And the terror extended even to the host's secret sanctuary. The threat of surveillance was a constant worry. There was that harrowing incident when Revolutionary Guards demanded access to the apartment's balcony to conduct a shootout with an armed man hiding in the garden below.
And in the middle of this high-stakes life-or-death confrontation, the source material offers this absurd detail that encapsulates the paranoia. The host and her housekeeper, Tahira Khanum, were terrified not primarily for their lives, but for the large, forbidden satellite dish they had hidden on the third-floor terrace.
They were more worried about the discovery of a piece of communication equipment than about a potential gunfight.
It perfectly illustrates how the regime managed to turn mundane items into existential threats. The satellite dish symbolized access to the forbidden outside world, access to other narratives. In their minds, getting caught with the dish meant inevitable interrogation and punishment, which was arguably a more pervasive long-term terror than the immediate threat of a stray bullet. They were all guilty simply by being normal citizens trying to access forbidden information.
So their deep engagement with Nabokov gave the class the tools to identify the enemy arbitrariness and posh lust. But they needed tools to build the internal moral structure to survive. And that's where authors like Henry James came in.
The class found Henry James challenging, especially novels like Daisy Miller and Washington Square. His surface realism gave them this false expectation that he should be easy. Yet his psychological subtleties, his intricate language, and his nuanced moral framework, it baffled students who were more accustomed to authors like Steinbeck.
They eventually found their footing in Washington Square, analyzing the plight of Catherine Sloper. She's trapped between her cruel, critical father, Dr. Sloper, and her spendthrift, manipulative suitor, Morris Townsend.
And the key analysis of the class focused on Dr. Sloper. They identified his unforgivable crime not as financial abuse, but as moral blindness, a fundamental failure of the heart, a lack of compassion. The host realized that empathy and pity are the required password for morality in James's modern fictional world. The true villain is consistently the creature without compassion.
For the Tehran students, this was a profound political realization. The regime's agents, the censor, the morality police, the ideological purists, they were all creatures without compassion, fueled by blindness, and a refusal to acknowledge the internal complexity of others.
And Catherine Sloper's final victory, after being broken by both men, is not conventional happiness or marriage. It's a hard-won integrity. She gains self-respect, refusing to yield to those who tried to define or possess her. That movement inward, making her whole, was a perfect blueprint for survival against external totalitarian control.
This focus on integrity and the critique of cruelty under ordinary circumstances, it carried seamlessly into their reading of Jane Austen, specifically Pride and Prejudice.
Austen's relevance to their society was immediate and painfully ironic. They adapted the novel's famous opening line, transforming it into this piece of dark political humor. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a Muslim man, regardless of his fortune, must be in want of a 9-year-old virgin wife.
That sarcastic inversion tells you everything. It highlights a painful truth. The Islamic Republic had effectively rolled back social progress, returning society to a state much like Austen's 19th century world, a world where girls married primarily for status, money, or security, but rarely for love. The system had restricted their choices, forcing them into a rigid social structure not unlike the one Austen satirized.
And the class concluded that Austen's real theme, much like James's, is cruelty not under extraordinary circumstances, but ordinary ones committed by people like us. Evil resides in the inability to see others, hence to empathize. And this links Austen directly back to that Jamesian concept of blindness.
And the social structure of Austen's world, particularly the structured ritual of the dance, became a powerful analogy for their own restricted public lives.
Right. The dance represents the constant, necessary adjustment between the public, regulated self and the private, desired connection. It mirrored their daily struggle to adapt to a partner's needs, whether that partner was a lover, a social expectation, or the repressive regime. They even noted that the inability to dance well, like Mr. Collins, signaled a general social awkwardness and a broader inability to adapt gracefully to a partner's needs.
This intense study of personal freedom and moral integrity inevitably led to the painful, complex decision some students faced, leaving Iran. a struggle that one student, Nasrin, called the ordeal of freedom, quoting Saul Bellow.
Nasrin's story provides crucial emotional context for this decision. She had been jailed for distributing leaflets, enduring true political hardship. Yet, after her release, she found the subsequent period of adjustment the hardest. Despite the horrors of prison, she missed the solidarity and the sense of common purpose she felt while she was incarcerated.
She realized she was 27 years old and didn't know what it meant to live or to love. She'd spent her entire adult life defined by resistance or imprisonment, so she needed to leave to discover who this Nasrin is, to define herself outside the context of the regime. The ordeal wasn't escaping hardship, but gaining the terrifying weight of free choice.
Yeah, and the cumulative pressure eventually led the host to her own decision to leave. Events like the Revolutionary Guards raiding the coffee shop while she was meeting her friend, whom she called the magician, reinforced the constant, exhausting need to pretend to be somewhere else just to survive. Life was no longer sustainable when every public moment required the construction of a protective fiction.
Her final conversation with her magician friend really encapsulates the profound emotional cost of departure. He challenged her guilt over leaving, arguing that she had done enough by helping the students create a parallel fantasy through pure fiction.
But he refused to communicate with her when she left. His self-defense mechanism was brutal, he said. Seldom seen, soon forgotten, out of sight, out of mind. It was his way of managing the inevitable pain of losing those who chose freedom, acknowledging that choosing freedom for oneself was also a painful act of separation and, maybe, betrayal for those who remained behind.
So if we synthesize this entire deep dive, what we see is this remarkable testament to the power of literature, not just as art, but as an absolute necessity for survival and self-definition.
The secret class was an essential safe harbor, where these women could articulate their deepest fears, their joys, and their personal narratives in their own words. They were seeing themselves in their own image, rather than the distortive reflection the regime offered.
Literature wasn't a luxury item. It was a fundamental tool. Through James and Austen, they identified empathy, pity, and integrity as the defining characteristics of goodness, while the political villain was defined entirely by blindness, carelessness, and lack of compassion.
And Nabokov gave them the vocabulary, posh lust, arbitrary dread, Gnostic turpitude, to understand the texture of the lie they were living within and the courage to resist that second crime, the loss of their own story, the loss of narrative control.
They used the safe space of fiction to fiercely safeguard their individual integrity and the right to define themselves outside the regime's definition.
And the essential philosophical question they grappled with remains universally relevant to anyone living in a highly controlled information environment. How does the soul survive when the public world is demonstrably structured on lie?
And the answer provided by these texts and this shared experience is that survival comes through love, through imagination, and through the ferocious assertion of one's own inner truth. The host noted that even when one physically leaves a totalitarian regime, the memory and the stain of that experience remain. They were fighting for the right to free access to imagination.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If facts only exist partially without emotion, if public life prevents the expression of private worlds, our dreams, our thoughts, and our desires, then how do you know you have truly existed?
If the external controlling world tells you who you are, the only reliable way to prove you were real and that your life was whole is through the fearless, constant assertion of your own imagined, complex truth. That's the deepest lesson of the deep dive.